Hello and welcome to Burke and Ryan. I'm Latika Burke.
And I'm Mick Ryan.
And this is our podcast where we'll explore topics around national security, modern conflict, and more. Welcome back to Burke and Ryan. I'm Latika Burke, your host today. Mick is delayed on a flight, so can't be with us. But we are very excited to have Peter Dutton join us on the podcast today. Peter Dutton was first elected to the Australian Parliament in 2001. He was promoted to the ministry by John Howard in 2004 and to cabinet by Tony Abbott in 2013 when the coalition regained power. In 2014, he was Immigration and Border Protection Minister. Later, that became an expanded Home Affairs portfolio. And then he became the Minister for Defence until the coalition's loss in 2022. He's now leader of the opposition, and we're delighted to say that he's here with us. Peter Dutton, welcome to Burke and Ryan.
Great to be with you. Thank you very much.
Mr. Dutton, let's start with your trip to Washington. You were just there for, I believe, the Australia-US dialogue. Was it troubling for you to see close up just how turbulent and perhaps unstable US politics is at the moment?
Well, I've had the great fortune of visiting Washington many times over the years, and I've established friendships on both sides of the aisle. I've worked with 3 administrations, and I've seen the system up close and personal for a long period of time. I have great confidence in the resilience, in the layers of redundancy, and the ability for the system to support a presidency regardless of what the circumstances might be that publicly makes it look messy. So I was encouraged that there was a strengthening of the relationship, which is the most important thing in my mind from an Australian perspective. And the Australian-American Leadership Dialogue is pretty effective in bringing people together from government, from non-government, and from the corporate sector as well. And I think there are a lot of relationships that have formed in forums like that can span over a long period of time. So as a result of all of that, I think I took away that we're in a pretty good position in terms of the relationship.
Now, you're obviously a conservative leader or a centre-right leader. Do you want Donald Trump to win? Is it in the interests of global security that he wins, or is it better for the world if the Democrats under Harris continue?
Well, as you would expect me to say, and as I will say, that is an issue for the American people. And as we don't like outsiders commenting on who should be the leader here or who Australians should be encouraged to vote for or not vote for, I'm not offering free advice to the American public. It's their judgment. It'll be made in November. And regardless of the outcome, as we've demonstrated over the last 100 years, we will be there with the Americans. They will be there with us. And we have the ability to strengthen the relationship regardless of the outcome of the election.
You were there during the NATO summit. This was a summit that the Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese did not go to. He sent his deputy with the excuse that Australia is not in NATO. Now, we're not in NATO. What role would you see for Australia in NATO or with NATO if you're the Prime Minister?
Well, I thought Prime Minister Albanese made a very serious error in not attending NATO in Washington. And that was reflected, frankly, in private conversations that I had with both Republicans and Democrats. Some of his own colleagues, I suspect, were miffed, to put it politely, that he didn't attend. Now, he's obviously sensitive about the amount of overseas travel that he's done in his first term as Prime Minister. There's been a lot of criticism of that. But my sense was that when we talk about the alignment that's taking place between Russia and Iran and China and North Korea and like-minded otherwise, I thought the summit in Washington was a particular point in history where it was very important for those despots to hear what we have by way of values in response, and standing together alongside those world leaders, I think was in Australia's interest. And frankly, I think it was in the interests of our global partners to send a very strong and united message. So out of NATO, to answer your question directly, we have a very important relationship in terms of intelligence sharing. There's an opportunity for us to continue to build relationships with European nations who probably, just because of the tyranny of distance and over time, have not become estranged from Australia, but have had other priorities, as has Australia and our focus on Asia and North America. So there's an opportunity for us to as a credible partner, as a credible defence partner, as a credible trading partner, and as a believer in the rule of law and the freedom of speech for us to play a very significant and influential role.
So would you like to see the Indo Pacific for that partnership formalised in any way? Because it's actually not just Anthony Albanese that has views about the expansion of NATO eastwards. It's countries like France, for instance, stopped Japan opening a NATO post because of that same sort of concern. Is there a fear that perhaps we go too far, or you would want to see anything like that formalised?
Well, I think you need to get the balance right. From our own perspective, again, we're a population of 25.8 million people, and we can't be everywhere in the world at once, but it is important for us to have a presence in our own region. I think the focus of ASEAN, which has primacy within our region, is important to emphasise. The Quad, obviously, as that continues to mature and develop, is an important focus for us. So the bilateral relationships are incredibly important. The multilateral arrangements are important as well. But the fact is that the world is focusing on South China Sea and East China Sea and the Himalaya border and what's happening in regard to the Philippines and other near nations. So that's the trend that we're seeing. It's hard to see how that will change over the coming decade and beyond. So there will be a massive spotlight into our part of the world, and we should be a very significant part of that and standing up for the values that we've defended over multiple decades.
So you'd go to NATO if you're invited as PM?
If we're invited to NATO, of course, we would be there. And I think it is. See, the Prime Minister creates himself a difficulty when he says, and I agree with his analysis when he says this, that we live in the most precarious period since the Second World War. If that's the case, then we should be acting as such, and we should be doing everything we can to deter any acts of aggression from any country, and making sure that we have proper investments, not just in our capabilities to deter, but also the relationships as well. And as I say, it's important not just for the emphasis on our region, but also what's happening in Europe at the moment as well. We have very significant investment into the relationship with Ukraine. We've provided significant support to repel Vladimir Putin, and we have equities in the peninsula, in Korea, obviously other very important equities in other relationships within NATO as well.
So let's talk about those convergence of threats. There's been a lot of soundings of alarms lately saying that we are approaching a point of war perhaps in the next 3 years. Do you share those assessments?
Well, I've been privy to the intelligence as Defence Minister and as Home Affairs Minister, and I've sat around the National Security Committee table for about 6 or 7 years. I haven't been privy to the latest intelligence, as you would understand, because we're in opposition. But the public utterances of Jens Stoltenberg and the American administration, our own Prime Minister, the British, the Canadians, all of that indicates a 2027 timeline. And countries should be doing all they can to preserve peace and make sure that that stability continues, because it's been the underpinning of our economic success. It's been the great achievement of modern China has been to lift people out of poverty and to have the ability to move into the middle class and contribute to their society and to China's global effort as well. We should be doing everything we can in listening to the advice and reacting and responding accordingly. The other point that I'd make is that President Xi has been very clear of his own intentions in relation to Taiwan. They're not seeking conflict, I accept that, but they're willing to take it forcibly if that's required. And the question is, what does that mean for the region, and what does it mean for Australia, for our near neighbours, and for the global peace and security that we've enjoyed for certainly since 1945.
So I'm coming to you from Taiwan. What is Australia's role if there is a conflict here?
Our role is to continue as we have, as a true and reliable partner to our most important allies. Five Eyes construct, the ANZUS agreement that we have with the United States, Quad, as I mentioned before, all of these are contemporary and incredibly important. And we have an obligation to make sure that peace prevails. And that's our immediate focus, to ensure that we can apply whatever pressure we can diplomatically through trade arrangements in terms of our own capabilities, so that an adversary would be able to weigh up whether Australia is a soft target or not. We know that bullies don't respect weakness, and together with those allies and partners, speaking with one united voice, we do have the greatest ability to stare down any act of aggression and to make the point of calculation a very difficult one for whoever might be contemplating taking an action. And that's the best approach that I believe is in our national interest.
What if deterrence fails? President Biden has been asked this question, and he has said on, I think, no fewer than 4 occasions, America would come to Taiwan's defence. Would Australia come to Taiwan's defence?
Well, I think, to be fair to President Biden, I think some of the statements that President Biden made were walked back or clarified by the White House subsequent to the statement being made. We don't have a position beyond the ambiguity that America's adopted for a long period of time, and we would see the circumstances at the time and make a judgment in that regard. But do we have an agreement with the United States under the ANZUS agreement? Have we just signed an AUKUS deal where, for the first time since the mid-1950s, America is sharing the secrets of the nuclear propulsion system? All of that is relevant to any decision that we would make, and that would be the reality for whoever was Prime Minister at the time.
Let's talk about AUKUS, seeing as you raised it. You were Defence Minister at the time that deal was announced. It's now been revealed to have an absolutely staggering cost, potentially at the cost of other defence capabilities and even other domestic priorities in Australia, such as social care. I think you've said previously you'd be willing to cut back on in order to pay for these subs. Is the outlay on these submarines too expensive for Australia?
No, it's not. And there's always a price of action and a price of inaction that you need to calculate. Australia, as an island nation, can't be without defences, and the nuclear propulsion system that we've signed up to with the Brits and the Americans gives us a great capability beyond the life of the Collins-class submarine. The Collins-class, which is a diesel-electric technology, is still the best in class. But as we know, as technology develops, they become ineffective if they are detected through the absence of the stealth capability that once served them well. I can understand the concern in relation to the expenditure, of course, and it's a very significant amount of money. But ultimately, Australia has to remain safe. We need to provide deterrence, and the nuclear submarines, with their ability to lurk off coastlines in our approaches to the north and to the west, that is a critical capability for us to remain a free, independent, democratic country that we are. So it will come at a cost. I don't believe that it needs to come at the cost of other capabilities or acquisitions within defence, and it is going to require a government that can manage the economy well and to identify waste so that we can prioritise the spending into those critical investments, and AUKUS is certainly in that category.
You're not going to just be able to accommodate that through waste cuts, though, are you? I mean, there will have to be some.
No, there's more funding required in defence. There can just be no question about that. Yet the Prime Minister can't say that we live in the most precarious period for 80 years, and world leaders are talking about the prospect of a world war in 2027 or shortly thereafter, and then not put extra money into defence. I think one of the travesties of the Albanese government is the money that they've taken out of defence and the way in which they've approached the investment that needs to be made and gone in completely the opposite direction.
Do you have a goal that you would set? I mean, we're having the same debate in the UK, for instance. The commitment there is that it goes to 2.5%, but there's no end date for that. What would your target be, and by when?
Well, we've set above 2%, and we achieved that when we were in government. And in terms of...
But so is the current government. They're above 2% now, aren't they?
See, the difficulty that the government's got is that they've cut back about $80 billion worth of capability. They've also had ravages of inflation created because of their own economic policies, but the reality of that which has struck a number of programs. I think there are efficiencies to be gained, and very significant ones, and a streamlining of some of the processes and decision-making around defence acquisition. We'll have more to say about that. But there is the need to prioritise. There is the need to increase defence spending.
To what, though?
But just, well, I think the difficulty with that, providing a figure of 2.5 or 2.3 or 2.8, whatever it might be, is that it's an arbitrary figure. It needs to be based on what you believe the acquisition and capability gaps that need to be addressed.
Well, what are they? I mean, do we need to boost our air defences? What are the capability gaps that you see? You are a former defence minister, of course.
Well, we certainly need to increase our air defences, and we certainly need to make sure that we've got the proper investment into missile technology. We put a lot of money into guided weapon systems. We have an enormous ability, just given the presence of the naval fleets from the US and the UK in our part of the world for at least the next decade and beyond. Have an incredible opportunity to provide support into that capability and sustainment programs for our allies as well. So there's an economic upside if we get it right, and we can build our capabilities and our ability to service different frames and assets from our partners. There's a huge opportunity there for us. So it's not just all one side of the ledger.
Mm-hmm.
I think you need, frankly, if I'm being honest, the advice from the chiefs and from the central agencies when you're in government to work out exactly what that figure should be. But in government, as I say, we had a big task of restoring it after very significant cuts to defence spending under the Rudd and Gillard governments, and we restored that gradually. And I think the crowning moment for us was the agreement between the US and the UK and Australia on the AUKUS program.
You have previously favoured just acquiring Virginia boats from the United States. Now there is a plan to design or co-design SSN AUKUS with the British. Do you still have your problems or your doubts about a co-design SSN AUKUS?
Well, one of the things that one of the lessons that we need to learn from defence acquisition is that the first in class or the first type is always burdened with cost overruns and time delays. My argument at the time was that we needed to take the pathway that would deliver the capability as quickly as possible because of the threats that we were speaking about before. And to try and condense the timeline as best we could was the priority in my mind. The government now has taken a decision in relation to the SSN AUKUS, and that is underway. So presumably they've done that because the advice was that they could acquire more quickly. If there are problems and cost blowouts and pushing to the right constantly, then we'd have to understand what the options would be. But I think the government's got us on a particular pathway now. It's maturing. The Brits are a great partner for us, and they were a very significant part of the reason we were able to get into the AUKUS arrangement in the first place. And they're a dear and abiding ally, and with a very rich history between our two countries. So we would work to the arrangement that the government's got, but I would be mindful of slippage in terms of time in particular at the moment.
I think that's the main concern for everyone. So how would we or you seek to mitigate that?
Well, again, part of the problem in defence acquisition more generally, and it's not just peculiar to Australia, but it is a particular problem that we need to deal with and to address here in Australia. The bespoke approach and the constant changes to design, all of that adds cost and it adds time to the manufacturing of the boat or the ship or whatever it might be. And we need to be more conscious of that. I think we have to have greater involvement of industrialists, not just men and women in uniform, for whom we have a great deal of respect, but we do need people with that industrial capability and acquisition experience to be further involved and more integrated, I believe, in the process.
You've boldly put nuclear energy on the table for Australia as a result of AUKUS, which is an embrace of nuclear technology itself. Is there a risk that you put the support for AUKUS at risk if you don't get your own idea of nuclear energy across the line, given how much of a no-no it's been for Australia in the past?
I just don't think so. I think AUKUS is now locked in, and I think the Labor Party, to their credit at the time, agreed to what we had proposed and did that on a bipartisan basis, and I think that's enduring. It could be at risk if there is a minority government after the next election and the Greens and the Green Teals are working in concert and holding a balance of power in the lower house. I think that's a risk that you could conceive of. But I think now people get a better understanding of why we need the capability. The agreement's been entered into, production started, people are being trained, billions of dollars are being committed to, and that's a pathway that our country can't deviate from. In relation to domestic nuclear, I was in Muswellbrook, northwest of Sydney, yesterday, talking to a coal community there about the transition. They get it, that with coal, there is an end of life that is coming, and for the coal-fired power stations, where are the jobs going to be created in these regional areas? It's a 3-hour plus drive from Sydney. The industry is not there without reliable, affordable energy. And if we look at the economies in France, in Canada, in the United States, including in China, as well as other European and Southeast Asian nations. The underpinning that they've got of their energy system is with the baseload power of nuclear. As we decarbonise, we need to do whatever we can at the lowest cost option to deliver that outcome. And nuclear is proven as a technology. It's rolling out around the world. And Australia, I think, given that we're the only one country out of the G20 that's not signed up to or hasn't committed to nuclear, we've got to get our skates on and make sure that we can provide the baseload security because if we don't have that security, we'll see a disruption to supply and we'll see further increases in prices. And communities like Muswellbrook, instead of under what we're proposing, where heavy industry will be attracted to the region and the jobs will thrive, you'll end up with communities wilting on the vine. And that's not something I believe that is in our country's best interests.
The nuclear debate will go on, I think, for another few years at least, if not decades. But I want to ask you some of your thinking on China. The current government's policy is stabilisation. Is that something you would continue if you're Prime Minister? And the relationship really did reach a nadir under your government. Have you thought about what you would do differently in relation to China next time?
Well, I think there are a couple of points here, and it's obviously an incredibly important topic. Firstly, of course, we want a stabilised relationship. We want a normalised relationship. We want to make sure that, given China's our biggest trading partner, that we can continue to grow the relationship. It was a coalition government that entered into the free trade agreement and created the billions of dollars of wealth at both ends of the equation. It was a coalition government also, as you referred to earlier, that made the decision around 5G that we wanted to exclude high-risk vendors. Now, other Five Eyes partners have followed that. Part of the reason I supported the decision and pushed very hard for that outcome at the time was that in a world where we have autonomous vehicles or remote monitoring of medical devices, we can't have a disruption by a state actor that could bring the network down and create havoc across society. We had to have a secure telecommunications system. Now, that upset China. We weren't overt in our decision. We weren't there to make the decision in a way that would offend Beijing, but they did take offence to it. And they saw a contagion effect as a result of Australia's decision could spread to other bigger economies, and that their companies like Huawei or ZTE could be excluded from those commercial arrangements. So I understand that the motivation and the sensitivity. But what was the alternative for the government at the time? Not to make the decision and to create the vulnerabilities. The security and intelligence advice was very clear that you couldn't mitigate the risk, even with billions of dollars, if you allowed high-risk vendors into the 5G network. So it was ultimately in our country's best interest. So that created a tension. And there are other points as well that you could identify over the course of the last coalition government where it created a tension. But in the end, our test has to be whether we're acting in our national interests. And that's the test that I would apply. We're not going to compromise on our cybersecurity settings because we know, as the Director General of ASIO has pointed out, Australia is under attack on a daily basis in the cyber wars. It upsets China or other countries that we attribute some of those attacks to them. But the fact is that they're conducting those attacks. And I think the Labor Party tries to talk out of both sides of their mouth because they see domestic opportunity for themselves here in Australia. But I just don't think you can compromise on what's in our national interest. We can be respectful. We want a strong relationship. But as China is not going to compromise on her national interest or her interest more generally economically, nor should Australia be expected to.
Well, Peter Dutton, the time has gone so quickly. So we've only got a few minutes left, but we're up to Ask Me Anything. So I'll let you go first, seeing as you've done all the talking. You literally get to ask me anything.
Well, it's just
and I'm a little nervous about this, given that we've known each other for quite some time.
Well, this is my favourite part of the interview, so it doesn't normally happen. So I would ask you, Latika, I mean, you were a very significant part and a big character in the press gallery in Canberra when you were here. You were a younger journalist, but you were a contributor, and I think you were an influencer, probably before influencers were necessarily a big thing. You've now had sort of the opportunity to look in from afar. How do you see the gallery and the Fourth Estate and the way in which media operates here in Australia now compared to your time when you were in the thick of it?
Well, I think there's a big generational gap in the press gallery now that wasn't there when I joined. So when I joined, there were absolute titans still in the gallery. And I remember looking up and just going, wow, all these terrific journalists who I'm going to learn from and absorb so much from. And I think if I was a younger journalist joining the press gallery today, I wouldn't have that same feeling. There's only probably a handful of those veterans still around. So I think that's a big shame. And I think journalism does really need to be supported better. I mean, the industry is in such trouble to have some of those older and more wiser heads around that can pass on that generational knowledge. So I think that would be the big dismay. But the other thing I would say is, to its credit, the gallery is pretty ferocious. So one of the things I observe in the UK is they do team up a bit together, and they're probably a bit more clubby than the press gallery might be in Australia. So one of the downsides is they don't hunt as a pack as well as the lobby does in the UK. But one of the other things they do is they will have a stronger ability to go after pollies like yourself,
when we need
Mr
to be
Dutton.
gone after. Well, Latika
Yeah.
Burke, thanks so much for your time today. It's been great
Wait,
interviewing
wait,
you.
I get to ask you
You've got to ask me
anything.
another question.
Wait, I get to ask you very, very quickly. I know
No,
you've
no.
got to go. I think I'm going to put my old press gallery hat back on for a second.
Okay.
And I did actually used to wear hats in the press gallery, lol.
You did.
I was wondering, you've had such a reputation in the past in some of your more divisive portfolios where I think you've actually enjoyed a little bit too much, maybe sometimes teasing or taunting some lefties or journalists even. Have you thought about how you might transition into a more statesman role if, the polls are suggesting you could be prime minister in 3 years, maybe, even if everything goes extraordinarily well for you in one?
Well, I've been leader for just over 2 years now. And I think over the last 2 years, people have been able to look at me more holistically and not just as the person delivering the attack line in question time, because that was my job to do, or because I'd taken a tough decision on a visa cancellation matter, or I was delivering an update on a terrorism threat. They're all very serious roles, and you do get typecast. And I don't recommend to anyone to go bald, because all of a sudden your whole persona changes and you're seen as a tougher guy, and all of that's just natural. But for me, when you look at where my favourabilities and the public's approval or disapproval of me, that's changed quite dramatically over the last 2 years to a position now where in some polling I'm ahead as preferred Prime Minister, or I'm taken, I think, much more seriously than I would have been 2 years ago. So it's been an opportunity for me, and that's why I've enjoyed this interview, because in longer form interviews, people can listen to you and hear a different side, or imagine you in a different way because you're talking on a topic that they haven't heard you talk on before. So there's that element which I think places us in a winnable position in the run-up to the election. But we haven't defeated a first-term government in this country since 1931. But again, to your point before about how the gallery's changed over the course of the last decade or so, how society has changed, the influence of social media, et cetera, I think in a contemporary sense, it's much easier now to conceive of a government changing after one term. And we've seen it at a state level where that's happened. I think we need to, for me, put the good policies forward, to do the work, to keep the government to account, to have a united team, which we've been successful at doing, which is, as you would recall, not always the case for oppositions in Australia, to be that credible alternative. And that's what we're projecting at the moment. And I intend to continue that right up until polls close, whenever the election might be held.
All right. Well, Peter Dutton, I'm looking forward to having you back on the podcast. Thank you very much for joining us this time.
Look forward to it. Take care. Thank you.
And that was Peter Dutton, former Home Affairs and Defence Minister of Australia and now Leader of the Opposition. Just a note on balance, we sent letters to the Prime Minister and Opposition Leader requesting interviews at exactly the same time. So far, only the Opposition Leader has gotten back to us. Thanks for joining Burke and Ryan. I'm Latika Burke, and if you're liking this podcast, please rate, review and subscribe to us. You can find both Mick and I on Substack and this podcast on wherever you listen to your podcasts.